Jonathan Ashford had always lived under the shadow of his family's legacy. The Ashford estate, sprawling across acres of land, was not just a home. It was a symbol of centuries of wealth, power, and an unspoken history. He had inherited this grand estate at a young age, with all its beauty and the burden that came with it. The mansion, the stables, and the land that stretched as far as the eye could see, everything was a part of a history he never asked for but had been born into. His father had never been an affectionate figure, but he had been clear about one thing. The Ashford name came with responsibility. Jonathan's life was not his own. It was for the legacy, for the estate, for the family. He had learned to suppress his own desires, his own dreams, to live up to the expectations that came with being an Ashford. But over the years, that weight had started to feel unbearable. There were whispers in the halls of the house, rumors about the family's true origins, stories that didn't match the image of grandeur that Jonathan had been taught to uphold. His father had always dismissed these as nonsense, but Jonathan couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something was amiss. He had tried to escape these thoughts, to focus on the estate and its upkeep, but every time he passed the old family portraits hanging in the hall, a sense of unease crept into him. It was as if the eyes of his ancestors were watching him, judging him for not being able to let go of the past. His relationship with his son, Edward, had only added to the tension. Edward had left the estate years ago, choosing a life away from the family business, away from the expectations that Jonathan himself had struggled to carry. At first, Jonathan had been disappointed, but as the years went by, he realized that Edward's decision was one of freedom, something Jonathan had never truly had. He had tried to focus on his work, particularly on the horses that had always been a source of comfort for him. Midnight Prince, his prize stallion, was his most cherished companion, but the unease never left him. On that particular evening, as a storm raged outside, Jonathan found himself staring at the flickering light in the stable, wondering what had disturbed the horses. The light was unusual, out of place, and he couldn't ignore it. The feeling in his chest told him that something was about to change, something that would finally force him to confront the secrets that had been buried in his family for generations. Without thinking twice, he grabbed a lantern and made his way outside, the storm beating down on him, but the pull of the stable stronger than the cold wind. As Jonathan made his way toward the stables, each step felt heavier than the last. The storm, relentless and furious, seemed to match the growing unease within him. His thoughts, though blurred by the rain and wind, were fixed on the strange light he had seen flickering from the stable window. The horse's restless behavior hadn't helped ease his growing sense of urgency. Midnight Prince, usually calm even in the worst weather, had been pacing incessantly, his whinnies cutting through the wind like a warning. Jonathan had never seen the horses so agitated. It was as if they were trying to tell him something he couldn't yet understand. The path to the stable was slick with mud, and Jonathan's boots sank deeper with each step. He barely noticed the cold, the rain soaking him to the bone. His focus was fixed solely on the stable, the horses, and that strange light. He reached the large wooden door, which creaked open with a push, the lantern casting a dim glow as it swung in his hand. The familiar smell of hay and leather filled his nose, but it was quickly overpowered by something else, something faint yet sweet. A scent that felt oddly comforting. Jonathan paused for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. It was strange. Everything about that night felt out of place. The stable, which had always been a sanctuary for him, now felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. He could hear the horses moving anxiously in their stalls, the sound of hooves scraping against the floor, the swish of tails, and the low snorts of agitation. Midnight Prince, though still agitated, seemed to quiet slightly as Jonathan stepped further into the stable. But something was different. The flickering light that had drawn him there seemed to pulse in the corner, faint and almost hidden behind bales of hay. Jonathan's heart pounded louder than the storm outside as he made his way toward the source of the light. And then he saw them. Two young women huddled together in the farthest corner, drenched and cold, their faces pale with exhaustion. They looked like they didn't belong, as if they had stumbled into the wrong place, yet there was something in their presence that felt strangely familiar. Jonathan's mind raced as he took in the sight of them. Their clothes were soaked and torn from the storm, their bodies huddled together for warmth. They seemed frightened, their eyes wide, but there was something about their faces, those eyes, that struck him. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the fear. It was a recognition, something deep within him that he couldn't explain. His heart skipped a beat. They weren't just strangers. There was something about them, a pull, an unexplainable connection that Jonathan couldn't shake. The lantern in his hand wavered as he tried to steady it, his mind still struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Who were they? Why were they here? And more importantly, why did they look so familiar? As the storm howled outside, Jonathan realized that this night, these women were part of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. A part of the story he had tried to avoid. Jonathan stood frozen, the lantern flickering in his hand as he tried to make sense of the scene in front of him. His heart raced as he looked at the two young women, drenched and shivering in the corner of the stable. The light from the lantern danced across their faces, revealing their features in stark detail. Pale skin, wet hair sticking to their faces, and eyes that held an unnerving familiarity. His mind was in turmoil, a chaotic swirl of thoughts, memories, and emotions that he couldn't quite piece together. He had seen those eyes before, those gray-green eyes that seemed to pierce through him. But where? When? He couldn't remember. His chest tightened as a strange feeling of recognition washed over him, but it was accompanied by a deep sense of confusion. These women didn't belong here, not in the stable, not in this place. They weren't part of the life he knew, the life he had carefully built for himself in the shadows of his family's past. He took a step forward, his voice faltering as he tried to ask them who they were. But before the words could leave his mouth, one of the women, the one who appeared to be slightly stronger than the other, raised a hand, her gaze locking with his. There was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that made Jonathan hesitate. It wasn't just fear. It was something more, something deeper. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but her words were interrupted by the sound of the horses growing more restless. Midnight Prince, his prize stallion, was neighing louder now, more urgently, as if sensing the tension in the air. Jonathan glanced over at the horse, whose eyes were fixed intently on the two women. It was strange. Midnight Prince was known for his wariness around strangers, but now he was strangely calm, almost as if he recognized them. Jonathan's gaze flickered back to the women, his mind racing even faster. Who were they, really? The younger woman, who seemed to be the more fragile of the two, looked up at him with wide eyes, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke. She said they needed shelter from the storm, that they hadn't meant any harm, and that they had nowhere else to go. Jonathan's instinct was to help. He had always been compassionate, always willing to offer a hand to those in need. But this felt different. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, like he was being drawn into something he wasn't prepared for. He glanced over at the other woman, the stronger one, who was holding her sister tightly, as if shielding her from the world. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope, as though she too was waiting for something, an answer, a gesture, a sign that she could trust him. Jonathan took a deep breath and steadied himself. He had to think. The storm outside was raging, the horses were unsettled, and these two young women, strangers, were in his stable, drenched and vulnerable. It would have been easy to send them away, to call for help, to do the logical thing. But there was a pull, something he couldn't explain, that urged him to do something different. Without fully understanding why, he made a decision that would alter the course of his life. "Come inside," he said quietly, his voice softer than he intended. "I'll have Martha prepare a room for you." As the words left his mouth, he knew that this was no ordinary encounter. These women were not just lost travelers seeking shelter from a storm. They were something more, something linked to the Ashford family in ways Jonathan could not yet understand. The storm raged on outside, but for Jonathan, this was only the beginning. The questions swirling in his mind, questions he had long buried, were now resurfacing. And whatever answers the future held, He knew that this night would change everything. The women followed Jonathan through the dark, rain-soaked garden, their feet slipping in the mud as they made their way toward the house. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air, thick with unspoken words and unanswered questions. As they reached the back door, Martha, the housekeeper who had been with the Ashford family for decades, appeared from the shadows. She had always been a figure of authority in the household, her gaze sharp and calculating, her every movement purposeful. Jonathan barely needed to say a word before Martha was already organizing the details. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice calm yet laced with concern. "Should I call the authorities?" Jonathan hesitated, looking back at the two women, who now stood uncertainly at the threshold. The storm outside was relentless, but it wasn't just the weather that made Jonathan uneasy. There was something about the women's presence that felt wrong, as if they didn't belong. But at the same time, there was a deep sense of recognition that he couldn't explain. Martha's question seemed almost too practical, too quick. It made Jonathan pause. "No," he finally said, his voice firm but soft. "Prepare the guest room in the east wing. They'll stay here for the night." Martha didn't argue. She merely nodded and retreated into the house to prepare the room as instructed. Jonathan, still holding the lantern, turned back to the women. The one who had spoken earlier, the stronger of the two, seemed to want to say something more, but she held her tongue, her face tight with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Jonathan felt it too, the unease. But he pushed it down, focusing instead on the practical matter at hand. The storm outside was growing worse, and there was little he could do except offer shelter. "You're safe here for the night," Jonathan said gently, his voice betraying none of the confusion that churned inside him. The younger woman, still clutching her sister, nodded slightly but said nothing. Jonathan led them into the house, feeling as though he were walking into a fog of uncertainty. The interior of the Ashford estate, usually so familiar and comforting to him, now seemed cold and distant. The warmth of the hearth didn't reach him. It couldn't. His thoughts were preoccupied, distracted by the women in his home and the nagging sensation that they were tied to something much larger than just a chance encounter. As they walked down the long hallway toward the guest room, Jonathan noticed how the house seemed to close in around them. The portraits on the walls, the elegant furniture, the old family heirlooms, all of it felt oppressive now, like a weight that hung over his shoulders. They passed by the large library where Jonathan had spent so many quiet evenings, but tonight it felt different, almost suffocating. When they reached the guest room, Jonathan gestured for them to enter. The woman with the scar near her chin stepped forward first, helping her sister inside. Jonathan stood for a moment in the doorway, his hand still gripping the lantern. He didn't know why, but he had to ask. "Your names?" he asked quietly. The woman with the scar paused, glancing at her sister before answering. "Victoria, and this is Emily Winters." The name hit Jonathan like a bolt of lightning. Winters. The Winters family was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name tied to his own family's history, a name he had tried to forget. He stared at Victoria and Emily, their faces so familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time. The name stirred something deep inside him, something buried. Jonathan didn't speak right away, his mind racing as the weight of their names settled in. Martha returned a few moments later, this time with dry clothes and a tray of food. The twins took the clothes gratefully, but the tension in the room was thick, and neither of them spoke. Jonathan stood there watching as they slowly began to remove their wet garments. His mind continued to race, his thoughts tangled in a web of questions and confusion. The name Winters had triggered something deep within him, something long buried. A memory? A family secret? As he watched them from the doorway, Jonathan could feel the walls of his carefully constructed life begin to crumble, the past that he had kept hidden now threatening to come to light. He didn't know how or why, but something about these two women, these Winters sisters, was going to change everything. What they were hiding, what they knew, would soon unravel everything Jonathan had ever believed about his family, his inheritance, and the legacy he had worked so hard to maintain. The past was finally catching up with him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The night dragged on in a heavy silence. Jonathan couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in him ever since the moment he'd opened the stable door and found the two women. He sat in his study, trying to focus on the pile of papers in front of him. But the images of Victoria and Emily Winters kept invading his thoughts. Their names had triggered something deep inside him, something he had tried to bury for years. The Winters family was part of a history Jonathan hadn't wanted to remember. He had grown up hearing stories about them, stories filled with scandal, betrayal, and a long-forgotten rivalry between their family and his own. It had been a rivalry that led to deep wounds, wounds that Jonathan had been taught to forget, to move past, and to keep hidden. But now, it seemed that the past had returned, uninvited, and with it, the Winters sisters. He couldn't ignore the connection he felt to them, despite the years of separation. The name Winters had been lost in the shadows of time, but it was now brought into the light in the most unexpected of ways. He knew he couldn't pretend any longer. Jonathan needed answers, but he had no idea where to begin. What were these women doing on his property, in his stable, after all these years? As he mulled over the questions swirling in his mind, he was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Martha entered, her face as composed as always, but there was something in her eyes that told Jonathan she was just as troubled as he was. "Mr. Ashford," she began, her voice low. "There's something you need to see." Jonathan stood up from his desk, following Martha down the grand hall and toward the guest room. The moment he stepped inside, his eyes locked onto the sisters. They had changed out of their soaked clothes and were now sitting at the edge of the bed, their bodies exhausted, yet their faces were filled with tension. Emily looked up as he entered, her eyes distant, as though lost in thought. Victoria, on the other hand, met his gaze with a quiet intensity, almost as if she was waiting for something from him. Jonathan's stomach churned. There was no mistaking the connection he felt between them. He could see it now, the similarities in their faces, the subtle family traits that echoed back to a time long before they were born. As he stood there, the pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle began to click into place. He couldn't explain it, but he knew deep down that these two women were not just any strangers. They were tied to his family, to the Ashfords, in a way that went far beyond mere coincidence. Victoria stood up first, her movements cautious but determined. "You must know who we are," she said, her voice calm but heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to speak first, but now that she had, he couldn't hide his confusion. "I know the Winters name," he said quietly, "but that doesn't explain why you're here or what you're really after." Victoria's eyes softened for a moment, but then her expression hardened, as if she had made a decision. "We've come to uncover the truth," she said. "The truth about our family, and yours." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. There it was again. Those words. The truth. The one thing Jonathan had spent years avoiding. The one thing that had haunted him for decades. The truth about the Ashford legacy, the one that no one ever talked about. The one buried so deep that even the most dedicated family members had forgotten about it. Jonathan knew at that moment that he couldn't run from it any longer. Whatever these women knew, whatever they had uncovered, would change everything. It was clear now. The past wasn't just something to be buried and forgotten. The Winters sisters were here to bring it all to light. And Jonathan Ashford, for the first time in his life, was going to have to confront everything he had ever tried to ignore. The truth was coming, whether he was ready or not. And deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning came, and with it an overwhelming sense of change. Jonathan awoke early, though sleep had barely visited him the night before. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, misty morning. As he stood at the window looking out over the estate, he couldn't shake the events of the previous night. Victoria and Emily Winters were still there, under his roof. But he had the strangest feeling that their presence was more than just a coincidence. It was as though the past had come alive again, stirring up memories that Jonathan had carefully locked away for decades. He felt unsettled, as though the foundation of everything he had known was beginning to crack. The truth, the very thing he had been running from, was now at his doorstep. He had always known there were things about the Ashford family's past that were hidden, secrets that had been swept under the rug, forgotten or ignored. But he had never imagined that one day those secrets would come knocking. Jonathan had been raised to believe in the importance of family reputation, of preserving the Ashford legacy. His father had taught him that family was everything, that the past was something to be respected and upheld. Yet now, as he stood there in the quiet of the morning, he began to question everything he had been taught. Victoria and Emily were the key to something larger, something far beyond what he had ever expected. After a long moment of contemplation, Jonathan made his decision. He couldn't keep avoiding the past. It was time to face it, to unravel the mysteries that had been buried for so long. As he made his way down the stairs and into the heart of the estate, he found Martha already preparing breakfast in the kitchen. She had been with the Ashford family for decades, and though she was often a woman of few words, Jonathan knew she had a deep understanding of the family's history. "Martha," Jonathan said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "What do you know about the Winters family, about their connection to the Ashfords?" Martha paused for a moment, her hands stilling over the pots and pans in front of her. She looked at Jonathan, her expression unreadable, before replying. "It's not something I can speak of lightly, Mr. Ashford. You know as well as I do that the Winters family has always been tangled with ours. But there are things that have been buried for years that we're better off leaving in the past." Jonathan felt his stomach twist. There it was again, the same sense of foreboding that had been haunting him since the night before. The secrets. He could feel them closing in around him. "I don't think we can leave them in the past anymore," Jonathan said quietly, his voice resolute. "The Winter sisters are here, and they've come for a reason. I need to know what's been hidden from me, from all of us." Martha didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to her work, her hands moving mechanically as she continued to prepare breakfast. The tension in the air between them was palpable, and Jonathan could tell that Martha was struggling with her own emotions. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke again. "You may not be ready for the truth, Mr. Ashford," she said softly. "But I fear that the Winters family, the truth they carry, will shake everything you've ever known." Jonathan's chest tightened at her words. He knew, deep down, that she was right. The truth would change everything. He had spent his entire life running from it, from the dark corners of his family's history. But now, there was no avoiding it. The past was here, and it wasn't going anywhere. After breakfast, Jonathan made his way to the stable, his mind racing with questions. The Winters sisters had already begun their work there, tending to the horses with an ease that was almost unsettling. Midnight Prince, in particular, seemed to respond to them in ways Jonathan couldn't explain. The horse, who had always been wary of strangers, now seemed calm and almost affectionate toward the sisters. It was clear that there was something more to this situation than mere coincidence. As he approached the stable, Jonathan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Today was the day he would have to confront the truth, the day he would finally have to face the secrets that had been buried for so long. And whatever came next, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The stables were quieter now, the storm's rage replaced by an eerie calm that seemed to envelop the entire estate. Jonathan stepped inside, his boots making a soft echo against the wooden floors, the scent of hay, leather, and the faint trace of the rain still lingering in the air. The horses, though still restless, seemed more settled now, as if the night's chaos had finally begun to settle. Midnight Prince stood at the far end of his stall, his large frame looming in the dim light, his eyes fixed on Jonathan as he walked closer. The stallion's usual wariness was gone. Instead, there was a strange sense of recognition, as if the horse was waiting for something. Or perhaps someone. Jonathan stood for a moment, watching the horse, his thoughts racing. The way Midnight Prince was looking at him, the way he had calmed down in the presence of the Winter Sisters, something didn't feel right. It was as though the bond between the horse and these women ran deeper than he could understand. Emily, the younger of the two sisters, was gently brushing the coat of another horse in the corner. Her movements were graceful, methodical, and strangely familiar. Jonathan couldn't help but watch her for a moment. She seemed at peace here, as though she belonged in the stables, as though she had always been part of this place. But there was something unsettling about the way she interacted with the animals. They responded to her in ways he had never seen before. As he approached, Emily glanced up, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was something in her gaze, something distant, but at the same time, piercing. It was as though she could see straight through him, as if she knew the questions swirling in his mind. She didn't speak, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a shared awareness that things were changing, that the truth was coming to the surface. Victoria, standing beside Midnight Prince, turned to Jonathan as he approached. Her expression was calm, though her eyes held a quiet intensity, a certain knowing that made Jonathan uneasy. It was clear now that these women were not just strangers seeking shelter from a storm. They were here for a purpose, and that purpose had something to do with his family's history, something Jonathan was not prepared to confront. "You've been quiet," Victoria said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made Jonathan pause. "I know you have questions, Mr. Ashford, and I know you don't want to face them, but the truth is here, whether you're ready or not." Her words sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine. The truth. That word had been haunting him for years, lurking just out of reach, always on the edge of his consciousness. He had tried to bury it, to ignore it, but now it seemed there was no escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jonathan replied, though his voice was less certain than he intended. "I don't know who you are, or what you want from me." Victoria stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "We want what's ours," she said quietly, "what was taken from us, and what was hidden from you." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. There it was again. The Winters family. The connection. The history he had tried so hard to forget. "You think I have something to do with this?" Jonathan's voice trembled slightly, though he tried to mask it. "I don't even know who you are." But as he spoke the words, he felt the truth in his gut. The Winters sisters were tied to something far deeper than he could comprehend. They weren't here by accident. This wasn't a coincidence. Their arrival, the name Winters, it all meant something. Jonathan knew that now. He could feel it in the air, a shifting, a quiet unraveling of the past. He looked at the two women, their faces resolute, unyielding. They knew more than they were letting on, and somehow they had come to bring it all to light. The truth was coming for him, for his family, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jonathan's mind raced as he stood in the stable, facing the Winter sisters. The truth that had been buried for so long, was inching closer to the surface, and he could feel it pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. Victoria and Emily were standing there, so calm, so certain, while he was drowning in confusion. Everything in him screamed to push them away, to tell them to leave and never return. But a deeper part of him knew he couldn't. The years of ignoring the past, the years of pretending that the Ashford family's history was untouchable, those years were over. He had spent his life keeping secrets, running from the truth, but the Winters sisters were here now, and they were determined to make him face what he had spent so long avoiding. As much as he hated to admit it, they had the answers. Answers that would finally make sense of everything. Why his father had been so distant, why his son Edward had left, and why the Ashford family had always felt so cursed. The realization hit him with a force that made his stomach turn. The Winters family, these two women, were connected to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Victoria stepped closer, her gaze never wavering from his. "We've come to claim what was taken from us, Jonathan. and we'll make sure that the truth is known. We won't stop until the legacy of the Winters family is restored and the Ashford name is exposed for what it truly is." Jonathan didn't know what to say. The weight of her words, of the past he had never known, threatened to break him. But as he looked at the two women before him, something shifted. He wasn't sure if it was the shock of the revelation or the sudden clarity that came with it, but he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. The truth had been brought to light, and no matter how painful it was the only way forward. He had no choice but to confront it, to face the consequences of the past. As he stood there, his mind spinning with everything that had just been revealed, Jonathan knew one thing for certain. His life was never going to be the same. The past had caught up with him, and there was no turning back now. Jonathan's world seemed to be crumbling in front of him, and yet in the midst of the chaos, something within him had begun to shift. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from the past. He was standing face to face with it. The weight of the revelations of everything he had just learned about the Ashford family's past was almost too much to bear. But as he stood there, in the stable with Victoria and Emily Winters, something within him clicked. It wasn't just about them, it was about him. The choices he had made, the life he had built, were all built on a foundation of lies. And now, the truth was out in the open, like a floodgate that couldn't be closed. Jonathan had spent so many years trying to preserve the legacy of the Ashford family, never questioning its origins or the price that had been paid for its wealth and power. But now the reality was staring him in the face. He had been complicit in a system that had robbed others of their rightful place in history. The Winters family, the true heirs to the legacy he had inherited, were standing right in front of him, and he couldn't ignore the fact that they had every right to claim what had been taken from them. He had always thought that his family's wealth and success were earned, but now he saw it differently. The Ashfords had built their empire on the backs of others, using deceit, manipulation, and betrayal to secure their place at the top. And Jonathan had been a part of that, whether he had known it or not. The guilt that washed over him was suffocating. He had spent his life trying to preserve something that was never truly his. And now, as the truth unraveled before him, he couldn't escape the reality of what had been done. The Winter sisters were here for justice, for retribution, and they were determined to see their family's legacy restored. Jonathan knew that this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about him, too. He had a choice to make. He could continue to hide behind the walls of the Ashford estate, pretending that nothing had changed, or he could stand up and face the truth. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his family's sins on his shoulders, and he knew that he couldn't carry them alone any longer. "What do you want me to do?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely a whisper. He was afraid of the answer, afraid of what it would mean for him and for everything he had worked for. But deep down, he knew that there was only one way forward. Victoria's expression softened, but only slightly. She stepped closer to him, her gaze steady and unyielding. "We want justice," she said quietly. "We want the truth to be known, and we want the Ashford name to be exposed for what it truly is." Jonathan's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. He had spent his life protecting that name, but now, it seemed that name would be the very thing that brought everything down. The truth was inevitable. And as he stood there, in the stable with the Winters sisters, he knew that there was no turning back. The past had caught up with him, and there was no escaping the consequences. But perhaps in some twisted way, it was what he needed. He had spent so long living in the shadows of his family's legacy, hiding from the truth, that now the light had finally found its way in. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Ashford felt as though he was free. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity and emotion, each moment more intense than the last. Jonathan had made his decision. There was no turning back now. The truth was out in the open, and as much as he had tried to avoid it, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The Winters sisters were not just here to claim what had been stolen from them. They were here to expose everything. The lies, the deceit, the corruption that had been hidden for generations. Jonathan knew that their mission was just, but it was also one that would cost him everything. The Ashford family's empire, built on foundations of secrecy and manipulation, was about to come crashing down. He had always feared the truth, had always believed that it would tear apart everything he had ever known. But now, as he worked alongside Victoria and Emily, he realized something profound. The truth wasn't just about destruction. It was about rebuilding, about restoring what had been broken. The weeks that followed were filled with tense meetings, legal battles, and revelations that shook Jonathan to his core. Documents long hidden in the dark corners of the Ashford estate were unearthed, revealing the full extent of his family's wrongdoings. The Winters family's wealth, once stolen, was now being returned. The legacy of the Ashfords was being rewritten. Through it all, Jonathan remained steadfast. He didn't fight against the truth anymore. Instead, he embraced it, knowing that it was the only path forward. The mansion that had once felt like a prison now felt like a place of healing, a place where the past could be confronted and laid to rest. There were moments of deep sorrow, moments when Jonathan questioned everything he had ever believed. But there were also moments of hope, of clarity. He could see now that the Winters family was not just seeking revenge. They were seeking justice, a justice that would allow them to reclaim what had been lost. And in doing so, they were giving Jonathan a chance to find redemption. The day finally came, when the last of the legal battles was resolved. The Ashford name, long synonymous with wealth and power, was now tainted by the truth of its origins. But Jonathan didn't care anymore. The legacy of his family had been built on lies, but now, the legacy of the Winters family would rise from the ashes. Jonathan stood on the steps of the Ashford estate, looking out at the vast land that had once been the symbol of his family's power. It was still beautiful, but it no longer held the same meaning for him. It was a reminder of what had been and what had been lost. He turned to Victoria and Emily, who were standing beside him, their faces filled with a quiet satisfaction. The journey had been long and the road ahead was uncertain, but they had done it. Together they had exposed the truth, and now they could finally begin to rebuild. Jonathan's heart felt lighter than it had in years, though there was still a deep sadness within him. The cost of the truth had been great, but the reward was greater. He had been given a second chance, not just to make amends for his family's past, but to live a life that was finally his own. As he walked away from the Ashford estate, Jonathan knew that he would never be the same. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. The future, with all its uncertainty, was his to write. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it.